Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my April wrap up. And I initially just wasn't going to film this video as I think I have 4 books to talk about, 4 physical books, but I actually read 2 ebooks, so that's 6 books. That's actually a very good number to be in a slump, but I literally have not read anything for the past 2 weeks. So these were read so long ago that I feel as though I have almost no memory of them. But I thought, why not film one? I do tend to go back and rewatch my wrap-ups from years past, and it's really interesting as kind of a bit of record keeping just to be able to look back and see how I felt at a certain moment in time about certain books. But this was a very, very lackluster month for me. I did DNF quite a few things, kind of continuing on from March. This was a DNF heavy month for me. And again, that's fine. I don't really care to talk about them here, but I do have one DNF that I'm going to mention because it is absolutely a permanent DNF and it's not the victim of me being in a slump. I think I just genuinely was not interested in it. So I will talk about that here. One book I technically am still in the middle of, but I'm gonna kick this out of the way this week. I'm gonna feel confident. I'm gonna be positive. I'm just gonna manifest that for myself. I am going to manifest finishing this book. The power of positive thinking is going to get me to finish this book. And it feels terrible to say that it's a book that I've been struggling to finish when it is in fact actually a middle grade. And that is Momo by Enda. I am halfway through this book. So I'm feeling pretty good about it, but the book is not 300 pages. So on the other hand, I do feel pretty terrible about it, like I've been pretty lazy. But this book has been living in my bag as a book to read outside the house. And I just don't take the opportunities to read that I used to take. A lot of time that I used to spend reading, like on my lunch break, for example, I don't really read anymore. But I've kept this book in my bag in the hopes that it would actually inspire me to read when I had time to read outside of the house. But that's really not happened, as you can see, because I do think I would have finished it by now had I taken advantage of all the times that I could have picked it up. But I would say of all of the books that I've read this month, this is the one that is the most positive reading experience. I think that's because I've been annotating the book. I've been reading this because one of my favorite K-pop idols, Suho from EXO, released a solo mini album that was based on this book. And so I started reading this before his album came out. His album came out like April 4th, I think. It's been a literal month, Jenny, and you're still reading this book. I started reading it before his album came out, but that's okay. But I decided to annotate it so that I could kind of understand the themes that he was talking about in the album. And it's been really, really interesting because he's gone on like Korean booktube channels and talked about this book and read passages from this book. He's given extensive interviews about how this book influenced his creative process for that album. And so it's just been really interesting to annotate this book with what he has said in mind, reading the lyrics of the songs, looking at the physical album. It's just been so much fun from that aspect that this has been a really positive reading experience. But I don't know that it's been a very enjoyable read. I think this is a book that I absolutely would not have picked up on my own. And so there are times that I have really struggled with it. I have enjoyed the process of reading it. I have enjoyed annotating it, like I said, kind of analyzing it for themes, but on a more basic level, is the book truly an enjoyable book to me? Now, that's where things get iffy for me. This is not, again, a book I would have picked up on my own. And I'm not really someone who's ever gotten into middle grade, and I feel bad. I feel like I'm somebody who's been very harsh on middle grade because it's not something that I ever even read when I was in the age range, in the target age range for it. And so I've always just felt like middle grade and I probably won't get along. This is a very deep book to be a middle grade book. And part of me wonders, would a child even enjoy it? This book is about the concept of time and these men in gray suits come in and steal time from you. And so like it's very deep because it's talking about how you waste time. What is wasting time? What is a useful use of your time? And so there are really deep and complex issues being talked about here that I think are really interesting, but I don't think would be interesting to a kid, or they wouldn't have been to me at this age. And otherwise, like, what's happening? What is the plot here? It's a very interesting book on a conceptual level because it's having some very interesting conversations. And I can see why it is something that an artist would hone in on as inspiration for their work. And so it's been interesting in that regard, but I think there are many reasons why I haven't finished it yet. And not all of them are due to me being in a slump. Not all of them are due to me not reading the book when I have the opportunity to do so. I think I'm not really pulled to picking it up. I enjoy it while I'm reading it, but it's not a book that I'm eager to get back into. I then read The Magnolia Palace by Fiona Davis. This was a mess from start to finish. I have almost no memory of this. This is a historical fiction that takes place in dual timelines. I think that's part of my issue with it. I am sick and tired of that. Let's just, one time, maybe just once, let's write a historical fiction novel about a woman that takes place all in one time period. Can you believe it? I think it can be done. I don't know why people want to do this, why they want to set something 20 years later, a storyline 20 years later, 40 years later. It is pointless to me. There is always one timeline that is more interesting than another. And that's the case here. I actually was very, very bored by both of the timelines here. I think I rated this book 2 stars. And that feels very generous because I just genuinely did not enjoy this. But it kind of has to do with the Frick collection, if I'm not mistaken. So the Fricks were a big kind of Gilded Age family alongside the Astors, people like that in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I thought there was going to be kind of a mystery element to this, that a piece of their collection went missing and people in another timeline were trying to figure out what happened to it. On a basic level, I guess that was present, but I just don't know. This one really fell flat for me, and I just thought that I would probably really enjoy it. I thought that I would try Fiona Davis because this one has been talked up a lot, I think. And I typically tend to like historical fiction that's been chosen by Book of the Month, and this has been one of the rare exceptions. But a lot of it is just that I am tired of certain archetypes, certain tropes. I don't know that you would call having a dual timeline a trope, but it is something that I am genuinely sick of. So this was a very lackluster one to me, and it's automatically going on my unhaul pile. Then I picked up, in honor of the 110th anniversary of Titanic's sinking, I picked up a book that was a passenger's survival tale, and I don't even know what this was called. I found it for free on Project Gutenberg because I've heard quite a bit about it over the years, and I believe it's often included in compilations with other survivor stories, but this was by Archibald Gracie, and he is such a fascinating person. This was a really, really fascinating read. And I did rate this 5 stars. I thought this was really interesting, and probably this is, alongside Momo, the most enjoyable read of the month for me because I got a lot out of this. I find it very difficult to rate memoirs of any kind because really, how am I going to put a star rating on your life story on something that you've been through? But I think that Archibald Gracie really did something very, very well here because he was a historian. And so the way he structured the book made a lot of sense to me and didn't feel at all chaotic, which I think is what you might expect from a survivor's tale of a disaster of the nature of Titanic. And so he did a really interesting thing where he talked about his perspective and things that happened to him at the start of the book. And then he told other survivor stories, and then he went into the Senate inquiry, which was so interesting to me, and how people were put on trial for this and how testimonies changed. He was very neutral. He tried to be very neutral, I think, but it didn't always work very well for him. But it was very, very interesting to get all of these different perspectives on different passengers and crew aboard the ship. And it was also really interesting how he broke down the lifeboats. He eventually wrote down each and every lifeboat and named all of the passengers on the boat and who they left behind. So family members who weren't able to get onto a lifeboat. His story was really interesting because he was on the ship until it went down. Essentially, he was on the ship until it fully sank. And so he got onto a collapsible lifeboat. So there were regular lifeboats that I think we're all familiar with, but there were a couple of so-called collapsible lifeboats on Titanic, which would have been kind of an emergency lifeboat, like, we've used all these others, we're gonna need the collapsible one. In a case like Titanic, of course they had to use these, but unfortunately the collapsible boat that he got on was capsized, and so they stood on top of the bottom of the boat until they were rescued the next morning by the Carpathia. And that was the last lifeboat to leave the ship. And so he essentially stayed on the ship until the last few moments. And it was just really interesting, his testimony. And I think he was so respectful. It was so genuinely emotional to me that he tried to record his last moments with known survivors, and if he didn't know their name, he would say, I'm sorry, I don't know who this person was, but this is what they were wearing, and if you know who they are, please contact me. And so it was just really moving. He wrote this immediately after the Titanic sank and after the Senate inquiry, and he died not long afterwards, I think in the same year, because he never fully recovered from being in the water, the shock to his system from the cold, because being on top of that lifeboat that was kind of capsized, he'd had to swim to get there. And so he'd spent some time in the water that unfortunately I don't think he ever recovered from. But it was really interesting just how he structured the book. I thought it was really well done. It was possibly the best book on Titanic that I've ever read. And so I really liked it. I felt like he tried to be impartial, but that just wasn't true in some cases, because of course also he made himself a hero. They rescued every woman aboard and all of this. Oh, he stayed on there helping women into the lifeboats, and I'm sure there were people who did, and he very well may be one of them, but of course in his own story he comes off very, very well. But he told this really emotional story of all of the men standing on this lifeboat and people swimming up to the boat trying to get onto it. And the officer who was on that lifeboat said, we can't take on any more or else the boat really will go under. And they were hitting people off. I mean, it was just incredible. And then one guy was swimming up to them and they said, we can't take any more on, I'm so sorry. And he says, well, that's all right, good luck and Godspeed. And he swam away. And Archibald Gracie said, I wish I knew who this brave soul was. And I thought, I know, that's just heartbreaking. Everyone on the lifeboat reported that as happening. That's not something they made up. And that was the most moving part of it. To me, that story was so moving. There's so much about Titanic that's so interesting to me, but it's interesting on a personal level when you use a passenger as your kind of eyes into the ship. And so I really liked spending time with Archibald Gracie because he was on the ship until the very end. But one interesting bit of controversy is he swore up and down that the ship didn't break in two, which we now know she did, that when she sank, she did eventually break into when water poured into basically the middle of the ship, and then her stern was out of the water. So that weight was unsupported and it crashed back down. And he would have been very, very close to this, but he swore up and down it didn't happen. And another guy on his lifeboat said, yes, it did. The ship split in half and he drew it. And I just think it's really interesting that a lot of different testimony was given about whether or not the ship split in half. And some of it from the crew, you have to imagine, they don't want to say the ship split in half because it looks like that's kind of faulty machinery or that the ship wasn't designed very well. But I thought it was quite fascinating that a lot of the passengers also didn't think that she split. And apparently it just was a very, very dark night. And when the electricity went out on Titanic, a lot of survivors say the only reason they knew she was still there was because she blocked out the starlight, which is so creepy to think about. It just was apparently an incredibly dark night. So I imagine people just weren't clear on what they saw. But that was a really interesting one. On the heels of that, I read Deep by Alma, which is kind of a ghost story that is set on Titanic. I was feeling very high on Titanic. This was good, but I think it had some structural problems. This mixed some fictional characters with real historical figures who were aboard Titanic, and there was kind of a ghostly presence on board, and that's really all I'm going to tell you. Things do get revealed. It's really interesting, too, that the author decided to tie in not only Titanic, but the Olympic's fate. And Olympic was Titanic's sister ship who sank in World War I when she was a hospital ship. And so the author tied those two stories together. So there was kind of a dual timeline here, but it worked very, very well for me because it was very short. It was only 4 years between the two timelines. So that worked very well for me. But what didn't work well for me was the ending of this book. I think it was far too rushed. Most of the book is a very slow build that gradually develops dread in you as the reader, as you're trying to figure out what's going on, and as you're also kind of dreading knowing that the ship is going to sink and she's going to hit the iceberg. So most of the book is this really nice, slow build. We spend a lot of time on board Titanic, and then I am not kidding, it has to be less than the last quarter of the book is when the ship sinks and all of the action really happens with kind of the ghost story. And I think you should know that going into it because I think you won't be as disappointed as I was. I really liked the slow, methodical quality to the writing, and I thought it built atmosphere incredibly well. But then that the ending was so rushed was such a massive disappointment to me. And I think it really ruined the book. It soured the book for me. But I do think I wound up rating this 3 stars. So not too bad, but gosh, I just wish that it had been given at least another 50 pages, and then there would have been time to breathe. But continuing on from that, let's go into my last couple of reads of the month, which were both disappointments to me. But to kind of continue on the historical fiction train, they are historical fiction. And these 2 books have taught me something about myself, and I'm going to listen to it from now on. I am not the type of person to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, in terms of reading. I think I really want to be someone who enjoys literary fiction, who enjoys award-winning books, but I think at my heart, that's just not who I am as a reader. And I'm gonna stop fighting it. I'm gonna stop making myself try stuff that I know I'm probably not gonna enjoy. And so one of these is my big DNF of the month. That's Beasts of a Little Land. This, along with the other book that I'm going to talk about, have taught me that I don't like a family saga. And I knew that actually before picking up either one of these books. Too much time is spanned. You don't have enough time to spend with the characters or to understand what's going on historically. Years pass so quickly that you don't get a chance to have a handle on what's going on currently before you've moved on to the next thing. And that's the case here. This is very, very fast paced. Now, I will say I was really into the characters. They made me want to continue on, but ultimately, I got the sense that I knew where the book was going and I just wasn't enjoying it. And so I decided to put this one down, and I'm never going to try a family saga again. I know that I don't like them. So the other book is a book that I actually finished, and it is a book that I thought I was going to give 5 stars when I started it. It's Pachinko. I almost rated Pachinko 2 stars on Goodreads, and I think I gave it 3 because there is a section towards the middle that really had me going. I mean, it was so good in the middle, but the rest of the book is so lackluster. This is one that left me scratching my head, and I hate books like that when you try a book that's been really acclaimed and you start wondering, what on earth was everyone talking about? Why is this book getting all of the awards? Why is this book getting all the attention when you've read others that are better than that? On a structural level, I'll say, I think Beasts of a Little Land is better written than Pachinko. Akin to Beasts of a Little Land, this is also a family saga, and it is also set in Korea. I don't know if I mentioned that, but Beasts of a Little Land is a Korean historical fiction. This, for the most part, is actually set in Japan, but it is about a Korean family. And historically, what was going on was very, very interesting to me. But this book, Oh my gosh, so much about it just really bugged me. The writing style, first of all, was my big problem with it, and I think I could have forgiven a lot of the other flaws had the book been more showy in a prose sense. The prose is absolutely nothing special. It is very clean, it's very quick, it's very short sentences. One example of something that irritated me is one that I just keep coming back to again and again. This was one of the big points of irritation I had with this book. Someone would say something and this girl would just start crying. It would be like, he said this, she wept, she cried. And you as the reader are going, why? Give me something. What is her emotional state? Why did that upset her? Now, sometimes it's obvious, but other times it's not. And that is the flaw of the book. You don't get very much of what's going on in a character's head. You are at arm's length. They may as well be telling you this from a very, very far distance. You don't even feel like at the end of the book that you knew the characters. That for me was the big problem with it. And I don't understand it because it seems like for a lot of other people, the characters were what kept them reading. There was one character that I truly loved, and he made the middle part of this book so phenomenal. I could not believe that the rest of it was written by the same person. It still had the same issues with the writing, but that middle part had a lot of heart. And what happened to him made me so angry. And so that leads me into another complaint that I have about the book. This was like a soap opera. When you thought that it couldn't get any more dramatic and over the top and unrealistic, it went there. This last quarter was just truly jaw-dropping to me. And I wish I could just give you spoilers so that I could tell you some of the things that happened and you would say this is literally an episode of Young and the Restless. I'm not kidding. That was the way this felt to me. I really did hate a lot of the characters though, and I think I was supposed to hate them. One of the main guys, I just despised, and I've since learned that unfortunately Lee Min-ho, who I have a massive crush on, plays him in the television show. So I know I'm gonna think he's hot when I watch the TV show. Speaking of the television show, I do think this will work well for me in a different medium because to me it felt like script writing, it felt like stage direction. That is how pared down the prose was. And so I do think in many ways it will work very, very well in a television medium. But so much about this book really irritated me. And I realized some of it's myself because there was also just this incredibly random scene where a character was apparently linked to the Yakuza in Japan, and I thought, oh yeah, here we go. Now something's gonna happen. The Yakuza will get involved, somebody will get killed, and then things will start to get interesting. And I told this to a friend of mine when I mentioned that I was reading this to him, and he said, Jenny, you don't like literary fiction and you don't like literary historical fiction. Stop trying to read this. He said, the Yakuza are not gonna come in and kill anybody. And I knew that, but I wanted it to happen so bad. I feel like that would have made things really interesting. But yes, this has taught me something about myself. These two reading experiences have taught me I don't like a family saga, so there's no need for me to try it. And I also don't really like what might be termed as literary historical fiction or something that's won some awards, if you know what I mean. Typically, I know for a lot of people, when they see that a book has won awards, that makes them move it up their TBR. For me, it tends to be the opposite. When I see a book has been garnering a lot of awards, it's been chosen by a lot of book clubs, I know it's likely not for me. And so I should have known that about Pachinko. There have been only a few exceptions to this for me in years past with literary historical fiction, and maybe only one, Wolf Hall. But otherwise, I don't tend to like stuff like this, so I don't know why I made myself read it, but I really thought I was gonna give Pachinko 5 stars. No, the middle section of the book is not enough to make up for the frustration that I experienced with the first third and the last third, but I genuinely loved one character in this book, and what happened to him infuriated me on many, many levels. And so in that way, the book is kind of successful. I'll say that. The book is kind of successful because it did garner a reaction out of me, an emotional reaction to at least one of the characters. And so in that regard, the book is a success. And I enjoyed parts of it, I really did, but for the most part, I just spent this book frustrated. And so many of y'all told me that I probably wouldn't like Pachinko, and I wish that I had listened to you. But those are the books that I read this month in April. Here's hoping that May is actually a decent reading month for once, and that I read something that I enjoy. Please tell me your thoughts on Pachinko down below, as I feel like this is really love it or hate it. I've seen a lot of people kind of torn on this one recently, and I know where I stand. I'm not a big fan of it, but I would love to know what you think of it down below. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.